Welcome to part two of the 1/6 review. Just as a reminder, I think what I'll do is I've made sort of the major claims that I want you to see in the notes up here. All of these things, and there's many of them that we can take from this, and the evidence for these will be down in here. So I'm going to let you scroll through the notes. I'm just going to hit some highlights. When we left off, we were looking at how other narratives, including the mention of Jack London inside of here, happened several times. Remember, Jack London, the narrative is that there's a fool heads off into nature totally unprepared, and the raw, unforgiving, indifferent aspects of nature usually kill or at least overwhelm the character. And we see mention of that here. We see that Galleon, remember Galleon is sort of the practical character in this, and we can read Galleon as probably what Krakauer admires in somebody and how they might go out into nature. They are prepared. They have local knowledge. McCandless is underprepared. That's what we learned. Galleon finds him underprepared, gives him his lunch, offers him his boots. There is no local knowledge, even though we do see that Chris McCandless was asking good questions, right? Galleon says this. He had good questions about the type of game that might be found there and those type of things, but he doesn't have the right rifle for big game. And so generally McCandless is underprepared. And so what are we to make of that? Those just seem like interesting facts that might make the story more interesting. But when interpreting this, what we can start to see is that Krakauer is forwarding a narrative not so different than the Jack London narrative, that only a fool would head off unprepared into nature. And who do we see as having the ideal relationship with nature? A practical person with local knowledge of the land, like Galleon, right? And so we see that starting to come across. We're starting to see some of the hard pastoral. The bush is an unforgiving place, right? That's that raw, unconquerable place of nature. So we're starting to see some parallels to some of the concepts we've seen in the past. So it seems weird to connect Into the Wild to, say, an 18th century oil painting when we first learned about the pastoral, but some things don't change, and that's what this course is all about. These older ideas are still with us, even if in very, very different forms and styles and genres and all of this type of thing, right? And so that's what we're looking at. So one thing we might start to do too is look at, and these notes are sort of peppered in there, some comparisons to Nick along the way. Alex seems very, very hard-headed. He just won't change. He wants to go in. Galleon sees him as hard-headed. We could read that also as problematic because hard-headed people head into nature and will perish. They're irrational and foolhardy as well, right? The people that seem to survive here seem to be calm, rational people. We know in chapter 3, that the person who knew Alex there that gave him a job, the grain operator, I believe it was, or something like this, also said that the problem with Alex, aka McCandless, was that he thought too much or overthought. So if you think too much, if you're hard-headed, if you're not practical and reasonable, you will die, right? Or at least you're not an ideal person, an ideal man, or don't have the ideal relationship with your environment. And that's kind of what Krakauer is showing us. Alex seems less than ideal, underprepared for life in the way that he's dealing with it, right? So this is very much unlike Nick. Nick had a lot of knowledge. He knew when to stop. He didn't go into the swamp, right? What else are we seeing about McCandless? Some anger at civilization. Here's some of the evidence for that. You probably remember it. How I feed myself is none of the government's business when he doesn't have a hunting license, right? So we're starting to see some of these things come out. And I talked about these in the beginning, but here's some evidence for that. You can take a look through those. He doesn't want anything having to do with civilization. So there's more proof that he has some of the pastoral mindset, even though he's more of an escapist. That's what I would say about him. He's looking to escape from civilization rather than to simply blend civilization better with the nature around him. Galleon believes he'll walk onto the highway. That's what any normal person would do. Again, McCandless is being set up as irrational in some way. And Nick was not irrational. He was shell-shocked in Big Two-Hearted River and had some cognitive struggles and some emotional struggles. But he was very, very calm and took his time. And so we're seeing a difference between these two characters. And we can understand McCandless better by thinking about what Nick was as well. So chapter 2 has the Jack London reference. Chapter 2's reference is from White Fang. Here it is, right here. And here is eternity laughing at the futility of life and the effort of life. It was wild, the savage, frozen-hearted Northland wild. And so this is what draws people in to conquer this, but it's why people lose as well. And that's typical of Jack London's stories. And that's what we're getting here. And so we can see reference to these things that we are learning in class. Notes here I've already mentioned, are we supposed to be aware of this? Does Krakauer want us to know that he's using this type of narrative? Or does he simply want us to see that McCandless is one of these fools, right? Depends how you want to read that. If we're supposed to be that knowledgeable or not of the actual narratives that construct storytelling. Chapter 10, we might ask why the history of the trail. This is worth looking at. My focus here is here, and we're looking at how adventure stories or nature writing is written, some common ways of writing it. So here in this paragraph, this is on page 10, he's showing us the exploration of the area, the legendary miners. So this is conquest and exploration going back to earliest America, or at least, civilization intruding here in the 1930s. So this is with the stuff of modern myth too, the humankind's conquering and dominating and overtaking. We see the development of it, if we want to tie it back to progress, right? Upgrading the trail and all of the construction that's there, the D9 Caterpillar. But here's what's interesting. We get that, which is fairly typical, and we see the progress narrative, and we see it tied into the myth of America, and we might even say manifest destiny and these types of myths that we know about, the mythology that drives the modern America and American history oftentimes. But then the project was halted. So what are we to learn from this? This is a terrain that is so inhospitable that it's hard, even with all of our modern technology, to develop it and conquer it. And yet McCandless has chose to go in there. So we see the common tropes, the common ways of writing about adventure writing, and also about the development. And then we see them fail. So we see them used, but differently than we would suspect. We're looking for bias again in the story. We're saying, well, what does Krakauer admire? He doesn't seem to admire McCandless that much, right? And sees him as too impulsive. If we look at the way the local hunters are treated, look at the way the local hunters, Samuel and Swanson, that's page 11, 12, 13 right in there, the people that find McCandless. They've got, they've got the right tools, they've got the ATVs and all these things to go in. They can move across the river easily. There's a sense of danger in this passage. Will they make it across? There's this fast river. But they seem to be able to survive in nature. They've got the right tools, the right practical knowledge if they're local, right? And look at the way that they're set up. If they're dominating the land, it's only a little bit. They're not seeing it as like an ecological strain on the land. But also look at what seems to be the ideal person, as in Krakauer's terms. Samuel, a man of strong opinions. So look at who is strong in here. The locals that have the tools to get in there and that know the land versus McCandless, who is weak and dies. We're starting to see the bias. And by bias, I simply mean the way the story is being told, the sort of stock characters that are appearing in here. Even these are real people. They're being set up as stock characters that we would expect to see in stories. The strong character, the weak character, etc., etc. And so we're getting the danger, the things that make adventure stories fun to read, right? But the danger, since it's not for McCandless, the danger here becomes the people going in to find him. Chapter 3, if we were to look at chapter 3, I'll quickly lead you through some highlights here. We would see in here more commentary on the American West as living space. Walt Stegner, a famous American writer, right? And some of the things that's been associated in our minds with escape from history and oppression. Again, every chapter starts with sort of commentary on what nature or the West means to us, or the type of stories that we tell ourselves, the associations. And these are meant to show us something about how Americans think, I would suggest, but also the type of things that McCandless himself might have been influenced by in order to choose Alaska as a site and to do what he did. Right. So we have, it's known as metafiction is the fancy term for it. It's storytelling that comments on its own means of telling the story. And that's what we're seeing here, I would suggest. All right. And so here's some of the things that come up. We also learn about Alex. He's a hard worker. He's a likable guy. There's some character building going on here. Like, he has strong morals. He seemed to set high standards for himself. But here's one other thing that comes in, that we could see as maybe Krakauer's opinion. Education and overthinking things become a problem. I mentioned that at the beginning. Well, I think maybe part of what got him into trouble was that he did too much thinking. Sometimes he tried too hard to make sense of the world. And so we can see that if you don't have a practical nature and you're too philosophical, perhaps you'll be drawn into believing in big, big narratives, similar to Jack London or what we see here. And that'll actually be a mistake. So practical people don't always, maybe this is what Krakauer is saying, aren't always overly philosophical. And they can sort of mine the gap between being insightful without thinking as an exercise in its own right. Because McCandless is college educated on the East Coast at a private school, right? And he doesn't like what he learned there, but it doesn't seem to have helped him survive out in the wild either. And so that's an interesting place to be here. I have a few notes here. These are similar to what I talked about in the beginning. So I'll kind of let you look through those. I'll pause the screen for a minute, and you can look at my notes as well. There are a number of potential answers to McCandless versus Nick. There are other answers that are possible, but here's some I put down. I'll let you take a look at those as well, and then a few other notes to close things down. All right. So, of course, these are not the only answers. These are just things that I saw and things that maybe you saw as well. Close things out, just a few other ideas, other notes that I jotted down. McCandless is likely the most anti-civilization character we'll read in this course of ours. If we wanted to compare him to Thoreau for a minute, Thoreau did not like civilization either. He saw it as confused and too busy, but he didn't venture that far out into the wild away from town. Thoreau is looking for some sort of a conversion experience as well, but much, much different in the intensity or the alienation that is required to construct a new self. And so we see a big difference between those two as well. I said Thoreau is solitude and reflection versus McCandless, which is simply escape from everything that he's built or that society has built. So very, very different there. A few minutes talking about Mark Fu's occurrence at Waimea Bay. The reason I put this last is it's actually the most traditional adventure story. It follows this fairly predictable pattern that you would see in a lot of magazines that have adventure stories. But here's what we might say about it. It's written in first person. Chance and opportunity are reinforced throughout. The dribbles get larger and larger on the bay and become the real Waimea, the giant waves. So there's something of this always in adventure storytelling. Everything was going fine until this happened, right? And so that's the general narrative trend, a retelling of events, a high promotion of potential risk and danger. We get the characters, oftentimes we get the characters' reluctance or unawareness before they went in there. They find their courage, or it's forced upon them in some way. The story often climaxes with an unforeseen event. It's like a bear on a trail, or in this case, a giant wave. And it ends always with their reflection about the learning of the power of nature, the luck of the living. You know, usually it's a bit of luck and pluck, and this is kind of where we see some overlap with Into the Wild. Some local knowledge, plus a bit of luck can help you survive the sheer power and unexpected, elements of nature. What the surfers have, of course, is they know where to surf, when to swim, when to avoid which waves, how to get out of the way. And so this becomes a story of how Mark Fu understands the water so well that he knows where to go to save himself. He doesn't even need the helicopter really in the end, right? And so we can read it that way, that adventure stories are understanding the land. And so there's some overlap with Krakauer there, and Krakauer is actually an adventure writer. So we can see how Krakauer has some of the values that we oftentimes see in your general average adventure story. So if we want to look at other things here, you can look through my notes again. I'm going to run out of time in the video. But Fu is an author. He's not a trained author, so he's not really crafting his character. It's just a retelling of events. There's no awareness of the framework used. It's not like what we saw in Into the Wild, in that metafiction level stuff where we're being told, here's the different ways of thinking about ourselves. And I'll kind of toss them in to kind of pique your interest and let you know how I'm telling the story. But what do we see? We see some competition among the surfers. We learn the respect and the power of nature, so we see them learning. What can we connect this to? The sublime, the power of nature, the hard pastoral, challenging things, the limits of humans, at least in this piece, right? We get some of the lingo and logistics of surfing. Chapter 2, being out in the wild, did this as well. What you have to do to survive out in the wild, what you have to do to survive the waves, right? We're being shown this constantly. What I did here is just took you through paragraph by paragraph to kind of showing you where those things are happening. Here's all of my evidence for my claims, so to speak. These are the general elements of an adventure story, but we could look at how Hemingway and Krakauer borrow from these but change them. We can connect even the surfing story to the hard pastoral and all adventure stories, the danger and sublimity of it all. But it's about survival more than it is permanent domination. And don't forget, in the adventure story, oftentimes it's some luck and some learning and local knowledge that matter too.